Behind drawn curtains, shadows whisper secrets. Welcome to Clue Hunt. I am your host, Elena Gray. Drop a comment with where you're listening. I treasure hearing from you all. Now, let's draw back the curtain. Willow Cottage sat quietly at the edge of St. Mary Mead, half hidden by ivy and lilac trees, its front path lined with forget-me-nots and pale blue tiles worn smooth by years of footsteps. It had stood there longer than anyone could quite remember, its whitewashed bricks and mossy roof always a comforting presence. But one morning in May, something changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, but just enough for Miss Marple to notice. It began with the curtains. From her sitting room window, Miss Marple had a perfect view of Willow Cottage across the meadow. She often watched the smoke rise gently from its chimney, or the postman stopping by its little green gate. But that morning she frowned. The curtains, lace with a faint rose pattern, had always been tied back neatly. That day they hung straight down, stiff and closed, like someone had shut the cottage's eyes. She sipped her tea and waited. By mid-morning, the milk delivery sat untouched on the doorstep. By afternoon, the curtains still hadn't moved, and by evening, when the sun cast long shadows across the garden, there was still no sign of movement behind those windows. Miss Marple didn't believe in rushing. But she did believe in patterns, and something about this felt wrong. Willow Cottage was occupied by Miss Lydia Gray, a quiet, well-read woman in her late 60s who had moved to the village only 2 years earlier. She kept to herself mostly, though always polite. She baked scones for the harvest fair. She loaned books at the library. She played a bit of piano on Sundays. But lately, Lydia Gray had looked pale, distracted. She had stopped attending the book club, stopped tending her garden. And now her curtains were closed in the middle of spring. Miss Marple reached for her hat. By the time she crossed the meadow, the sky had turned a soft lavender. She knocked gently on the cottage door. No answer. She knocked again, waited, then slowly turned the brass doorknob. The door creaked open. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender water and dust. The ticking of a clock echoed from the sitting room. But the house was still, not silent, just unnaturally still. And then Miss Marple saw it. On the windowsill, half tucked behind the curtain, was a long, thin tear in the lace. A sharp rip, not from wear but from force. And below the window on the floor, a small glass vase lay shattered. Miss Marple didn't panic. She looked carefully around the room. A cup of tea untouched on the side table, a single slipper on the carpet, and a chair slightly pulled back, as if someone had stood up quickly. She stepped closer to the sideboard and noticed a photograph. Frame turned face down. She lifted it. Inside was a picture of Lydia Gray as a young woman, standing beside a man in uniform. Not a husband, perhaps a brother, perhaps more. But it was what lay behind the photograph that made Miss Marple pause. A folded letter, yellowed with age, addressed in careful handwriting. To be opened in the event of my absence. Miss Marple, heart steady, mind sharp as ever, returned the frame to its place. She didn't open the letter. Not yet. She simply said softly into the quiet house, "Lydia, dear, where have you gone?" The morning after discovering the silent cottage, Miss Marple sat by her writing desk, the letter from Willow Cottage, resting carefully before her. She had taken it with her, not out of impulse, but out of a quiet, grave duty. Lydia Gray was missing. The teacup had gone cold, and the curtains, still drawn, whispered that something unsaid was waiting to be uncovered. The envelope was delicate. A soft ivory shade creased at the corners. It bore no stamp, only a single line in faint blue ink, to be opened in the event of my absence. Miss Marple, ever respectful of secrets, paused before opening it. She knew the weight a letter could carry, particularly one left behind like a breadcrumb. She broke the seal gently. Inside were 2 pages, neatly written, no dates, no names, just quiet truths arranged like stepping stones across a stream. You are reading this, I have likely gone, not by choice, but by necessity. There are things I kept hidden for too long. During the war, I worked as a decoder for naval intelligence. There was a man, Peter. We were never married, though. We meant to be. He died on a mission no one was meant to speak of. What followed was a lifetime of silence. Miss Marple read slowly, her fingers barely touching the page. The words were composed, but heavy with grief, the kind buried for decades. But secrets have gravity. They pull people toward them. Last year someone found out, someone who should not have, I don't know who. I only know I've seen shadows near my windows, unfamiliar footsteps near the cottage late at night. Someone knocked on my door 3 times and left without speaking. They wanted the letter Peter wrote me, the last one. It is hidden, and it must remain so. Miss Marple's eyes lifted. The broken vase, the torn curtain. The chair hastily moved, Dot. This wasn't only about Lydia's past. It was about someone now, someone who had searched that cottage, Dot. She returned to the letter. If I am gone, tell no one until you've checked the loft. The beams hide more than cobwebs. Miss Marple folded the letter gently and placed it back into the envelope. Her mind moved swiftly, reviewing every word, every pause in Lydia's voice during past conversations, every odd look, every half-finished sentence. The loft. Willow Cottage had a narrow staircase that led to an attic space just above the bedroom. Most villagers assumed it held only old trunks and moth-eaten curtains, but Miss Marple now understood something more had been stored there. Later that day, she returned to the cottage. The windows still wore their veil of silence, the curtains unmoved. Inside, she moved with quiet purpose, her steps respectful of the home's memory. The loft stairs creaked under her feet as she climbed. The space above was dark and dusty. The light bulb flickered weakly. But as she scanned the rafters, her eyes caught something, a narrow panel slightly ajar. Behind it, a flat tin box wrapped in linen. Inside the box was the letter Lydia had mentioned, yellowed paper, navy insignia, and a name she hadn't expected: Peter Halcroft. Captain. And with it a second item, a faded photograph of Peter and Lydia, their arms entwined, a beach behind them, wartime uniforms, smiles filled with stolen peace. But it was the corner of the photo that made Miss Marple frown. There was a second man, barely in the frame, wearing the same uniform, and in that man's eyes, even in that small sliver, was something sharp, watchful, unsettling. She took the photo downstairs and compared it to a picture she'd seen years ago in the village archives, a commemorative photo from 1943 of returning officers. The same man stood 2 rows behind, unnamed. But next to him, a name. Thomas Bexley. Miss Marple whispered it aloud. Mr. Bexley, now retired, lived in the outskirts of the village, kept to himself, known for long walks and old medals, and, as the postmistress once whispered, a cold sort of man. Now Miss Marple knew where to go next. Lydia hadn't vanished. She had run, or been forced to flee, because someone had come looking for a letter never meant to be found. And someone in St. Mary Mead still remembered that secret. The afternoon light shifted gently across St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple walked the narrow path toward the edge of the village, where the air grew still and hedges leaned just a little closer to the road. She wore her light blue shawl not because of a chill, but because something about it, the way it draped neatly over her shoulders, made people underestimate her, which was, in her own words, terribly useful. Ahead stood a modest cottage with a wooden gate painted a dull brown and a brass plaque bearing one name, Bexley. Dot. She knocked once, then twice. A pause, then the door creaked open. Thomas Bexley stood before her, taller than she remembered, his posture still rigid with military pride, though softened by age. His eyes, pale grey, flicked over her with faint curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said. "Unexpected." "I imagine most things are at your age," she replied kindly. "May I come in?" He hesitated, then opened the door wider. The cottage smelled of pipe tobacco and varnished wood. The sitting room was lined with medals in frames and dusty books on wartime intelligence. Bexley gestured toward a leather armchair. "To what do I owe the visit?" Miss Marple settled in, folded, her hands in her lap. "Do you remember Captain Peter Halcroft?" The name hung in the air like a bell struck in an empty church. Bexley did not answer immediately. He leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable. "I knew of him. And of Lydia Gray. She worked with us," he said. "A capable woman." Miss Marple nodded. "There was a photograph taken before Peter died. You were in it." He didn't respond. His eyes had narrowed, not out of anger, but calculation. She continued, voice calm. "Peter wrote Lydia a letter. A final one. He trusted her, confided in her. That letter still exists. Someone, recently, went looking for it. At Willow Cottage." Now Bexley looked at her directly. "And you believe I'm that someone?" "I believe you were closer to Peter Halcroft than most knew, that the past has a long reach, and that when people lie, their shadows grow restless." He stood abruptly and walked to the window. The sunlight cast his figure long and thin across the wooden floor. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "Peter and I worked under the same division, but he disobeyed orders. He fell in love with a message clerk. He shared classified information. He thought no one would notice." Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. "You mean Lydia?" Bexley turned, and now there was something bitter in his voice. He trusted her more than his own comrades, and it cost lives. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "And yet, he died a hero." "Officially," Bexley replied. "Unofficially, we buried his record, made him a martyr. Guilt is a quiet punishment." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did Lydia know?" "She suspected," he said, "but she kept her silence. That was her strength, until now." He sat down, the weight of years suddenly pulling his shoulders down. "I didn't break in," he said. "I knocked. She didn't answer. I saw the window was loose. I opened it, searched the cottage. I was looking for the letter. If it got out..." Miss Marple's voice was sharp now. "You mean if the truth came out, that Peter Halcroft was betrayed not by the enemy, but by his own?" The room was quiet. Bexley didn't answer. Instead, he reached to a drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. "I found this years ago," he said. "Never turned it in. Couldn't bear to destroy it. But I didn't want it seen either." Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of Peter's last written orders, and a note scribbled hastily on the back. "If anything happens to me, it won't be the Germans. Trust no one, even those in your own room." Miss Marple read it twice. Then she stood. "Mr. Bexley," she said, "you may not have killed anyone, but you have kept a truth buried that nearly destroyed an innocent woman. Lydia didn't run from you. She ran from the feeling she'd been hunted by her past. And that's cruelty enough." She turned toward the door. "You have a chance now to put something right." He didn't move as she left. Outside, the evening wind had picked up. Leaves scattered across the path like pages torn from old files. Miss Marple returned to Willow Cottage, not to investigate, but to wait. That evening, just before sunset, a young constable knocked gently on her door. "We found Miss Lydia Gray," he said. "Safe in a room at the inn she'd been hiding. Said she'd left quietly, frightened by someone searching her home. Miss Marple smiled. "Tell her she can return," she said. "The curtains can come down now." And they did. By the next morning, Willow Cottage's windows were open again and sunlight poured in freely. Willow Cottage was quiet again, but no longer in that uneasy, watchful way. The curtains had been drawn open, revealing vases of wildflowers and the warm flicker of lamplight in the hallway. Miss Lydia Gray had returned. Her steps were slower, her eyes a little red, but there was relief in her voice. A sort of breath she'd been holding for years finally let go. Miss Marple visited her the following morning, carrying a tin of homemade walnut biscuits and a small envelope, not sealed, but respectfully tucked beneath a ribbon. "I believe this belongs to you," she said softly, handing it to Lydia. Lydia held the envelope for a long moment. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. They sat in the garden together, the sun warming the tops of the lavender bushes, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke. Only after her second sip of tea did Lydia open the envelope and unfold the letter Peter had written. More than half a lifetime ago. She read it once, then again. And then she spoke. "I always knew," she said, or at least suspected, that something had gone wrong, that Peter had trusted the wrong person. But I didn't want to believe it. "Not really." Miss Marple said nothing. Lydia's voice was calm, but there was a sadness in it, not of loss, but of time. I stayed silent because I thought I was protecting his memory, but really, I was protecting mine. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "You left the photograph turned face down," she said. "Why?" Lydia smiled faintly. "Because it hurt to look at. Because there was a day, just one, where everything felt safe. And when he died, even the memory felt dangerous. I couldn't face it." She paused, folding the letter slowly. "I never married. I had chances, you know. But Peter was the only man who ever made me feel understood." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes one name is enough." Lydia looked out across the garden. "Do you think the village will judge me for vanishing, for hiding?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "St. Mary Mead has very little patience for secrets, but it has great respect for pain. Once they understand, and they will, they'll simply say, 'Poor Miss Gray,' and offer you extra jam at the tea tent." Lydia laughed softly, the first time in many days. "But what of Bexley?" she asked. "Will he tell his story?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I believe Mr. Bexley will do what suits his conscience. Whether that means silence or confession is his burden to carry." Lydia looked at the letter one more time, then rose and walked to the open window of the cottage. The wind caught the lace curtain and lifted it gently, just enough to let the light touch the photograph, now turned face up once more. "I think I'll keep it like this," she said. "Let the house see the sun again." Miss Marple stood, her work done. And as she walked back across the meadow, she thought, not about secrets or betrayal, but about how much meaning could be sewn into simple things. A closed curtain, a turned photograph, a teacup once cold. And how, with just enough patience, even the quietest truths found their way into the light. 2 days after the garden tea with Lydia Gray, Miss Marple sat once again by her window, knitting needles clinking softly, though her fingers moved without real thought. Her mind was elsewhere, on the letter Lydia had read and the one Bexley had handed over. Something, she realized, had been quietly bothering her. It was the ink. She remembered the way Peter Halcroft's signature had looked. Too smooth. The kind of smoothness that modern pens produced, not the wartime ink of a fountain nib dragged across rationed paper. And then there was the corner of the page, too clean for something folded and hidden for over 40 years. Miss Marple didn't say anything at first. She simply waited. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Mr. Digby, the village librarian, and part-time amateur archivist. He was delighted, of course, to assist Miss Marple in anything remotely involving old paper and secrets. "It's an odd question," she had said politely, "but could you help me compare ink types from letters?" Dated around 1943, Mr. Digby, thrilled, produced an entire binder of preserved wartime correspondence and invited her to examine several pieces, mostly old ration forms, a letter from a wounded soldier, and one postcard from France. She spent nearly an hour reviewing them. The ink, as expected, was darker, with uneven strokes, signs of blotting, age, and time. None of it matched the clean, crisp handwriting in Peter's so-called final note. "Modern forgery," Digby whispered, as if they were in a spy film. Miss Marple only smiled. Or something more clever, something personal. That evening, Miss Marple returned to Willow Cottage, where Lydia was arranging flowers in a narrow porcelain vase by the fireplace. "Lydia," Miss Marple said gently, "may I see the letter again?" Without hesitation, Lydia retrieved it from the drawer. Miss Marple read it one more time. The wording was clever, careful. It implied betrayal. It suggested danger, but it never said directly what had happened. And then, in the margin, faint, but still visible, was a second line of writing, barely legible. "Don't trust the girl. She knows too much." Miss Marple blinked slowly. That line hadn't been there before. She looked up. "Did you ever show this to anyone else?" she asked. Lydia hesitated. "No one. Except... the day I found it, I did take it briefly to the vicar. I wanted someone else to know it existed, just in case. He said he'd keep it in his safe for an hour while I calmed down." "Why?" Miss Marple's heart sank. The vicar. Of course. Not that he was untrustworthy, but someone might have had access to the church office. And someone with strong motivation could have quietly swapped the original. Miss Marple stood. "I think we must visit someone together," she said. That evening, they returned to Mr. Bexley's home. He seemed surprised but not alarmed. Miss Marple held out the letter. "You said this came from Peter," she said, "but I believe it didn't." His face twitched. "This wasn't written during the war," Miss Marple said firmly. "It was written recently, on modern paper, in ink that doesn't match wartime correspondence. And most of all, it has a warning Peter would never have written." She took a breath. "You forged it." Bexley didn't respond immediately. Then, quietly, he said, "I copied it, from memory. The original was lost. I needed something to protect myself." "Protect yourself from what?" Lydia asked, her voice sharp now. Bexley's eyes were tired. "I did betray Peter. Not directly. I passed on information I shouldn't have. It compromised a mission he led. I didn't know it would cost him his life, but it did. And when I heard you'd kept his last letter, I panicked. I thought it contained details that could ruin everything, my pension, my name." "So you created a version," Miss Marple said softly, "one that painted Lydia as dangerous, so you'd have an excuse to search her home." He looked at Lydia. "I'm sorry," he said. "I let fear drive me." Lydia, for a moment, said nothing. Then she stood. "You can keep your name," she said, "but not the truth. That belongs to Peter. And I'll make sure it's remembered right." Miss Marple, satisfied, left them alone. And in her notebook that night she wrote one line. "Lies age poorly. Truth, however quiet, always survives." The following week, the village seemed to hum with a different sort of energy. Not noisy, not scandalous, but quietly curious. Word had spread, not widely but delicately, that Lydia Gray had been involved in something mysterious, and that Miss Marple naturally had helped to clear it up. Such phrases floated around the bakery queue and drifted through the air at the post office, but no one dared ask directly. In St. Mary Mead, mystery was expected, but dignity was always preserved. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid another visit to Willow Cottage. The garden was brighter now, the shutters open, and there was a vase of fresh peonies on the window ledge, their soft pink petals catching the morning light. Inside, Lydia sat at her writing desk, sorting through boxes of old letters and belongings. She had never quite had the strength to examine until now. "I found something," she said as Miss Marple entered. She handed over a small leather-bound diary, worn, cracked at the spine, the initials PH pressed into the cover. "I didn't even realize I'd kept it," she said. "I suppose I was so afraid of holding on to too much that I forgot what mattered." Miss Marple opened the diary slowly. Inside were pages of Peter Halcroft's neat, disciplined handwriting, some entries about training, others about the war, and several about Lydia herself. But it was the final entry that made Miss Marple's fingers pause. "I've told Lydia what I know. There's a leak, not from the enemy, but from within. Bexley has access to movement orders. I don't think he realizes the consequences of what he's doing, but someone is using his reports for personal gain. If anything happens to me, it won't be chance. I've given Lydia a separate letter. Not for publication, not for scandal, just the truth. I trust her more than I've ever trusted anyone." Miss Marple read the words aloud slowly, letting them settle into the quiet cottage air. Lydia stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "That's what I remembered him saying," she whispered. "That I should keep the letter safe. That it wasn't about revenge, just truth." Miss Marple closed the diary gently. "You should donate this," she said, "to the village museum. Along with the letter, the photograph, and perhaps the curtain lace too." "The curtain?" Lydia blinked. Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, that torn lace you kept in the drawer. It's part of the story now. When the curtains fell, the truth came in." By the end of the week, a new display had appeared in a corner of the St. Mary Mead Heritage Room, beside an old spinning wheel and a shelf of war medals. Inside, a glass case rested. Peter Halcroft's diary, Lydia's handwritten summary of events, the original letter now framed a strip of the curtain lace, folded gently like ribbon, and a small plaque that read, "Willow Cottage, where silence ended." Villagers passed by it, often, some with interest, some just to nod politely. But Miss Marple knew what it meant. It meant Lydia had found peace, that a name had been cleared, that even in a sleepy village, memory had power. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her own sitting room. She poured herself a quiet cup of tea, took up her knitting, and thought of Peter's words, written in a moment of fear, entrusted to love, now delivered at last. And in the hush of twilight, she smiled softly and whispered to herself, "Secrets lose their sting when truth has a voice." A week had passed since the Willow Cottage exhibit opened, and already the air in St. Mary Mead had turned towards summer. Roses thick with colour, bees lingering over lavender, and the sky pale blue from morning till dusk. Life, as it always did, carried on. Children raced bicycles past garden gates. The baker's bell chimed at 4:30, and old Mr. Toller finally managed to trim the hedge he'd grumbled about since April. But inside one small sitting room on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat in, her favourite wicker chair with a shawl across her shoulders, and a cat, not hers but one that visited regularly, curled at her feet. The teacup beside her steamed gently. Not delicate porcelain this time, but a sturdy one, navy blue with a single white rim. Ordinary perhaps, but familiar. She had received a note that morning. Just a few lines, written in graceful hand. "The curtains are up again, but they'll never be drawn in fear. Thank you for seeing what I couldn't. With all my warmth, Lydia." Miss Marple smiled. She'd known, of course, that the story didn't end with letters and lace. Real closure came not from exposing wrongs, but from helping people reclaim what had been stolen. Quietly, with dignity, she thought back to the moment she'd first noticed those curtains. How odd it had felt, that tiny shift in routine. That's where all great discoveries began. A cup left untouched, a curtain drawn at the wrong time, a feeling that something wasn't as it should be. Many believed mysteries were made of grand clues and dark crimes. But Miss Marple knew better. The real ones began with a whisper, a hesitation, a glance from someone trying not to be seen. And what had this mystery truly been about? Not war, not betrayal, not even a hidden letter. It had been about silence, the heavy kind. And what happens when it lingers too long in the corners of an old house? About memory, and love never spoken loud enough, about how time may bury things, but it never destroys them. Miss Marple looked toward her garden. The sunlight danced through the window, catching the petals of her geraniums, which had bloomed early this year. And somewhere across the village, at a small museum display, a single strand of torn lace now rested in peace, not as evidence, but as remembrance. She picked up her knitting once more, her fingers moving with quiet rhythm, and thought how strange it was that even curtains, those softest of things, could tell a story. If you listened carefully. Just before the sun dipped below the horizon, she set down her yarn, took one last sip of tea, and said, almost to herself, "Curtains may close, but some windows never forget." And in that moment all was well again in St. Mary Mead.